We are going to read chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at a giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide, and at the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped away some dirty water into his mouth and then swished it around, trying to filter it through his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth. He had to try again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head onto it and lapped some water, then jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down to the mountain to look for the shovel, so we could make the whole water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars for drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone to make it back up again, and he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish, whitish flowers that seemed to extend all the way around the big thumb. He took a deep breath and then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked up one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that formed into a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he would have to do it soon while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still laying doubled over on his side. "I have to tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes and his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," said Stanley. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confusion seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed and he drifted into sleep. Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree is just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. Chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now as he sat gazing at the big thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder more about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling the entire plant, including the root. "Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions!" Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen! It was a beautiful spring morning, and the sky was painted a pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and peach trees along the shore. Miss Gladys Tennyson was wearing her nightgown and her robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat. So it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. "Good morning, Miss Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserves most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," said Miss Tennyson, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted me to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word! He said they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Miss Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Miss Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know you're parading around in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you," said Miss Tennyson. "We both have been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from a stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Miss Tennyson, "but it nearly killed Becca, what with her being so young. But Sam saved her life." "Oh, it wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca is all right," Hattie said contritely. "I'll keep telling Jim he needs to wash the knives," said Miss Pike, who owns the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself and then turned and quickly walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, she can come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Miss Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want a few onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right then," said Miss Tennyson. "Give my change in onions." Sam gave Miss Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept on and off the next 2 days, ate onions all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, the big thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think he had been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done a lot of good for him as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure where he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching and he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up toward the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There is no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to carry Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting to climb back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation of the weeds a little further down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there. He had come this far already. There, laying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and a sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and sack might have rolled down the hill. None of the jars were broken except the one that had broken earlier, and if they rolled down the hill, it was doubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way up the hill, back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a very long, hard climb. And last chapter for today is chapter 41. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled the onion he liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it was better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was in the dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks, and all their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks in the hole, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled the jars and poured the water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad, I'd find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd just gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they found out I didn't have a mom, then that would have made me a ward of the state. What's a ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Stanley remembered Mr. Pendanski telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew that he had become one. I liked sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend that I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I'd see them at the park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Cub Scout, said Stanley. I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat. I liked the blue uniform, said Zero. Maybe I wouldn't have liked being a Cub Scout. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mother once was a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you didn't have a mother. Everybody has to have a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She said once she won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies. She was real proud of that, said Zero. Stanley peeled off another layer of onion. We always took what we needed, said Zero. When I was little, I didn't even know it was stealing. I don't remember when I found out. But we just took what we needed, never more. So when I saw those shoes on display at the shelter, I just reached in the glass case and took them. Clyde Livingston's shoes? Asked Stanley. I didn't know they were his. I just thought they were somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of brand new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. The next thing I know, everybody's making a big deal about how the shoes are missing. It was kind of funny in a way. This whole place was going crazy. I was wearing these shoes and everyone's running around saying, "What happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone." I just walked out the door. No one noticed me. When I got outside, I ran around the corner and immediately took off the shoes. I put them on top of a parked car. I remembered they'd smelled really bad. Yep, those were them, said Stanley. Did they fit you? Pretty much. Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingston's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingston had small, quick feet. Stanley's feet were big and slow. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I'd already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of the shoe store with a brand new pair of sneakers. If I had just kept those old smelly sneakers, neither of us would be here right now. All right, that's the end.